Handling situations with limited panelboard access requires a multifaceted approach that prioritizes safety, code compliance, and legal considerations. The recommended approach starts with clear communication with the homeowner. Explain the National Electrical Code (NEC) requirement for 3 feet of clear space in front of the panelboard. Emphasize that this requirement is in place for safety and to ensure accessibility in case of emergencies, such as needing to quickly shut off power during a fire or electrical fault. Make sure the homeowner understands the potential risks associated with obstructed access. Next, explore alternative solutions with the homeowner. Suggest options such as moving the workbench entirely, modifying it to allow for adequate access to the panelboard, or installing another panelboard in a more accessible location. Discuss the pros and cons of each option, taking into account the homeowner's needs and budget. It's crucial to document the situation thoroughly. Take photos to clearly document the limited access, noting any potential hazards or obstacles that impede access to the panelboard. Keep a written record of your communications with the homeowner, including the date, time, and content of each conversation. This documentation can be invaluable in the event of a future dispute or liability claim. If the homeowner refuses to provide adequate access to the panelboard, it may be necessary to decline the service. Explain that proceeding with the work under such conditions would be a violation of the NEC and could put the occupants and property at risk. It's important to stand your ground on this issue, as your professional reputation and liability are at stake. If the homeowner is unwilling to comply with the NEC requirements, consider referring the matter to a higher authority such as the local building inspector or licensing board. These authorities have the power to issue code violations or require modifications to bring the installation into compliance. Cooperate fully with any investigations or inspections that may result from your referral. In situations where complete access to the panelboard is impossible, there are alternative options that may provide a partial solution. If the panelboard is partially accessible, consider using extenders to access it while maintaining some distance. These extenders can help you reach breakers or other components that would otherwise be out of reach. If possible, consider cutting a small access panel in the workbench to allow for limited panelboard manipulation. This may involve using a saw or other cutting tool to create an opening in the workbench that provides access to the panelboard. Install a remote disconnect switch in an accessible location that allows for emergency shut-off of the power. This switch can be used to quickly energize the electrical system in the event of a fire or other emergency. Regardless of the approach taken, it's essential to prioritize safety at all times. Ensure that the workbench is secure and not at risk of falling onto the panelboard. This could create a dangerous electrical hazard. Use caution when climbing over or around obstacles to access the panelboard. Wear appropriate personal protective equipment, such as gloves and safety glasses, to avoid potential hazards such as electrical shock or injury from sharp objects. Failure to provide clear access to the panelboard can create legal liability in the event of an electrical accident. If someone is injured or property is damaged as a result of the obstructed access, you could be held responsible. That's why it's so important to document the situation, communicate your concerns to the homeowner, and take steps to mitigate the risks. The NEC is very specific about the working space required around electrical equipment. This space is intended to provide enough room for electricians to safely and effectively work on the equipment. The specific requirements vary depending on the voltage of the equipment and the presence of exposed live parts. In general, the NEC requires a minimum of 3 feet of clear space in front of electrical equipment operating at 600 volts or less. This space must be free of obstructions that could impede access to the equipment. For equipment operating at higher voltages, the required working space may be greater. The NEC also specifies the minimum height and width of the working space. The height must be at least 6 feet 6 inches or the height of the equipment, whichever is greater. The width must be at least 30 inches or the width of the equipment, whichever is greater. In addition to the working space requirements, the NEC also requires that there be a clear and unobstructed path to and from the working space. This path must be at least 3 feet wide and 6 feet 6 inches high. The purpose of these requirements is to ensure that electricians can safely and easily access electrical equipment for maintenance, repairs, and inspections. Failure to comply with these requirements can create a dangerous situation and may result in fines or other penalties. There are several potential legal implications associated with obstructed electrical panel board access. Firstly, negligence. If someone is injured or property is damaged as a result of obstructed access to an electrical panel board, the homeowner or property owner could be found negligent. Negligence occurs when a person fails to exercise reasonable care to protect others from harm. In this case, the homeowner could be negligent if they knew or should have known that the obstructed access created a dangerous condition. Secondly, code violations. Obstructed access to an electrical panel board is a violation of the NEC and local building codes. Violations of these codes can result in fines, penalties, and even criminal charges. Thirdly, liability. If an electrician or other worker is injured while attempting to work on an electrical panel board with obstructed access, the homeowner or property owner could be held liable for their injuries. Liability is a legal obligation to pay damages for harm caused to another person. Fourthly, insurance implications. Insurance companies may deny coverage for damages caused by electrical fires or other accidents if the electrical system is not in compliance with the NEC and local building codes. This means that the homeowner could be responsible for paying for the damages out of their own pocket. Fifthly, real estate disclosure. When selling a property, the seller is typically required to disclose any known defects or hazards in the property. Obstructed access to an electrical panel board could be considered a defect or hazard that must be disclosed to potential buyers. Failure to disclose this information could result in legal action by the buyer. To avoid these legal implications, it's important to ensure that electrical panel boards are easily accessible and in compliance with the NEC and local building codes. This includes maintaining a clear working space around the panel board and keeping the path to and from the panel board free of obstructions. Firstly, carefully assess the situation. Before taking any action, carefully assess the situation to determine the extent of the obstruction and the potential hazards involved. Take photos or videos to document the obstruction and any potential safety risks. Secondly, communicate with the homeowner or property owner. Explain the NEC requirements for clear access to electrical panel boards and the potential safety risks associated with obstructed access. Try to work with the homeowner to find a solution that allows for safe and easy access to the panel board. Thirdly, explore alternative solutions. If it's not possible to completely remove the obstruction, explore alternative solutions such as moving the panel board to a more accessible location, installing a remote disconnect switch, or creating an access panel in the obstruction. Fourthly, document all actions taken. Keep a detailed record of all actions taken to address the obstructed access, including communications with the homeowner, alternative solutions explored, and any modifications made to the electrical system. This documentation can be invaluable in the event of a future dispute or legal claim. Fifthly, consult with a qualified electrician. If you're not sure how to safely address the obstructed access, consult with a qualified electrician who can assess the situation and recommend appropriate solutions. Sixthly, report the violation to the local building inspector. If the homeowner refuses to address the obstructed access, you may need to report the violation to the local building inspector. The building inspector has the authority to issue a code violation and require the homeowner to correct the problem. Seventhly, decline to perform the work. If you're not comfortable working on an electrical panel board with obstructed access, you have the right to decline to perform the work. Explain to the homeowner that you're not able to safely perform the work due to the obstructed access and that they need to hire someone else to do it. The NEC provides specific guidelines for working space around electrical equipment to ensure the safety of qualified electrical workers. These requirements are outlined in NEC Article 110.26 Spaces about electrical equipment. Firstly, depth of working space. The depth of the working space in front of electrical equipment depends on the voltage of the equipment and the conditions present on the opposite side of the working space. Condition 1. If there are exposed live parts on one side of the working space and grounded parts on the other side, the minimum depth of the working space is 3 feet for equipment operating at 150 volts to ground or less, 3.5 feet for equipment operating at 151 volts to 600 volts, and 4 feet for equipment operating at 601 volts to 2500 volts. Condition 2. If there are exposed live parts on both sides of the working space, the minimum depth of the working space is 3.5 feet for equipment operating at 150 volts to ground or less, 4 feet for equipment operating at 151 volts to 600 volts, and 5 feet for equipment operating at 601 volts to 2500 volts. Condition 3. If there are no exposed live parts on either side of the working space, the minimum depth of the working space is 3 feet for equipment operating at 150 volts to ground or less, 3 feet for equipment operating at 151 volts to 600 volts, and 4 feet for equipment operating at 601 volts to 2500 volts. Secondly, width of working space. The width of the working space in front of electrical equipment must be at least 30 inches or the width of the equipment, whichever is greater. This width must be maintained for the full depth of the working space. Thirdly, height of working space. The height of the working space in front of electrical equipment must be at least 6 feet 6 inches or the height of the equipment, whichever is greater. This height must be maintained for the full depth and width of the working space. Fourthly, access and egress. There must be a clear and unobstructed path to and from the working space. This path must be at least 3 feet wide and 6 feet 6 inches high. The path must not be blocked by equipment, materials, or other obstructions. Fifthly, illumination. The working space must be adequately illuminated to allow workers to safely perform their tasks. The NEC requires a minimum illumination level of 10-foot candles in the working space. Sixthly, headroom. The working space must have sufficient headroom to allow workers to stand upright and move freely. The NEC requires a minimum headroom of 6 feet 6 inches in the working space. Seventhly, dedicated equipment space. The space above and below electrical equipment must be kept clear of other equipment and materials. This dedicated equipment space is intended to provide room for future expansion and to prevent damage to the electrical equipment. Eighthly, foreign equipment. The working space must not be used for storage or other purposes that are not related to the electrical equipment. Foreign equipment, such as piping, ductwork, and sprinkler systems, must not be installed in the working space. Ninthly, guarding of live parts. Exposed live parts must be guarded to prevent accidental contact. Guarding can be provided by enclosures, barriers, or other means. Tenthly, working space for equipment operating at over 600 volts. The working space requirements for equipment operating at over 600 volts are more stringent than those for equipment operating at 600 volts or less. The NEC requires a minimum working space depth of 4 feet for equipment operating at 601 volts to 2500 volts. 5 feet for equipment operating at 2501 volts to 9000 volts, and 6 feet for equipment operating at 9001 volts to 25,000 volts. It is important to note that these are just the minimum requirements for working space around electrical equipment. In some cases, it may be necessary to provide additional working space to ensure the safety of workers. Here is some additional information about the use of extenders, cutting access panels, and remote disconnect switches. Extenders. Extenders are tools that can be used to reach into tight spaces and manipulate electrical components. They typically consist of a long handle with a gripping mechanism at the end. Extenders can be used to operate circuit breakers, tighten screws, and perform other tasks that would otherwise be difficult or impossible to do. Cutting access panels. Cutting access panels in a workbench or other obstruction can provide access to the electrical panel board. The size of the access panel should be large enough to allow workers to safely and easily access the panel board. The edges of the access panel should be smooth and free of sharp edges to prevent injury. Remote disconnect switches. Remote disconnect switches can be used to de-energize the electrical panel board from a remote location. This can be useful in situations where it is not safe or practical to access the panel board directly. Remote disconnect switches typically consist of a switch that is mounted in an accessible location and a cable that connects the switch to the panel board. When the switch is turned off, it disconnects the power to the panel board. Here's a summary of safety considerations when working around obstructed electrical panel boards. Firstly, de-energize the circuit. Before working on any electrical equipment, always de-energize the circuit by turning off the circuit breaker or removing the fuse. This will help to prevent electrical shock. Secondly, wear personal protective equipment. Wear appropriate personal protective equipment, such as gloves, safety glasses, and a hard hat to protect yourself from injury. Thirdly, use insulated tools. Use insulated tools to prevent electrical shock. Make sure that the tools are in good condition and that the insulation is not damaged. Fourthly, be aware of your surroundings. Be aware of your surroundings and watch out for potential hazards, such as sharp objects, slippery surfaces, and overhead obstructions. Fifthly, never work alone. Never work alone on electrical equipment. Always have someone nearby who can help you in case of an emergency. Sixthly, follow lockout-tagout procedures. Follow lockout-tagout procedures to ensure that the circuit remains energized while you are working on it. This involves placing a lock and tag on the circuit breaker or fuse to prevent someone from accidentally turning the power back on. Seventhly, inspect the equipment. Before working on any electrical equipment, inspect it carefully for signs of damage, such as cracks, frayed wires, and loose connections. If you find any damage, do not work on the equipment until it has been repaired or replaced. Eighthly, use proper lifting techniques. Use proper lifting techniques to avoid back injuries. When lifting heavy objects, bend your knees and keep your back straight. Ninthly, keep the work area clean. Keep the work area clean and free of clutter. This will help to prevent accidents and make it easier to work. Tenthly, know your limits. Know your limits and do not attempt to do work that you are not qualified to do. If you are not sure how to do something, ask for help from a qualified electrician. Working with electricity can be dangerous, so it is important to take all necessary precautions to protect yourself from injury. By following these safety tips, you can help to ensure that you have a safe and productive work environment.